It's great to be with you tonight. My name is Don Hilton. I'm actually a neurosurgeon over in San Antonio. In the year 2000, first base meant deep throat kissing, groping, and fondling. Second base meant oral sex. Third base meant going all the way, and home plate meant learning each other's names. Getting to home plate was relatively rare, however. Unfortunately, that's very true today. And of course, pornography demonstrates that perfectly. There's no names in pornography. I think we're more than that. I think the human experience is more. I think what we are, I think our brains deserve better in terms of what we have become as human beings. When we think, we actually create physical changes in the brain. He describes that and basically talks about how we have a thought that creates a whole cascade of what I call desire engines in the brain. DNA it cranks out proteins that tell other proteins what to do. And in the end, it actually builds, literally, new wires between brain cells because a thought occurred. A physical structure takes place. Thoughts are real. Fascinating book titled Memoirs of an Addicted Brain. A neuroscientist examines his former life on drugs. Mark Lewis was addicted to every drug you can imagine. And later, after being caught breaking into a doctor's office seeking drugs, found recovery, wrote this book, and he's published his neuroscience papers now. And he describes dopamine, the chemical mover that gets us to chase after whatever it is we want, whatever spells relief. For starving animals, dopamine makes the brain a vehicle for seeking food. For addicts, it sends the brain hunting for drugs. In fact, dopamine-powered desperation can change the brain forever because its message of intense wanting narrows the field of synaptic change, focusing it like a powerful microscope on one particular reward, whether in the service of food or heroin, of love or gambling. Dopamine forms a rut, a line of footprints in the neural flesh, and those footprints harden and become indelible, beating an intractable path to a highly specialized and limited pot of gold. Dopamine, norepinephrine, these are catecholamines. And we've always known that catecholamines were related to depression. We were sidetracked by serotonin for a while. Serotonin is important in emotion. It's an uplifter. But the real driver is catecholamine. It's that fight or flight, go get them. And norepinephrine or adrenaline is only one methyl group different for you chemists from dopamine. They're very similar. They're cousins. And dopamine has become very important. This is crack cocaine. People want this stuff, and they want it enough to face bad drug deals down. Gary's already talked about dopamine receptors. I'm not going to spend time. Cocaine blocks that. You can see how cocaine blocks those receptors. So what it does is it keeps dopamine in that synaptic cleft. It's not reuptaken into those receptors. It stays there too long, and it keeps driving dopamine. It keeps driving wanting. And of course, these drugs, you can see morphine, a 200% spike in dopamine, which is very equivalent to this slide Gary showed on sex, about a 200% spike in dopamine, similar to opiates. So these are powerful. People try to minimize natural addiction, food, sex, gambling. They're not as important as drug addiction. Well, actually, the annual cost of obesity of $190 billion a year actually eclipses the total cost of drug abuse. Natural addictions are very expensive, and this isn't taking into account pornography, its effect on human emotion, on human pair bonding, on jobs. How many people fire at work having issues for sexual harassment? Look at the military today. Dopamine does degrade receptors in the brain, whether it's cocaine or obesity, just as Gary was talking about a minute ago. And it resets that pleasure thermostat of the brain. It creates a new normal. With fewer thermostats, we now have a different definition of what feels good, what normal is, and what it takes to get that high that's reset. So yes, there are natural and there are drug addictions. Natural addictions are process addictions. Cross-sensitization means that because dopamine receptors are downgraded, it doesn't matter whether it's sex or amphetamine. It's downgraded. There's cross-sensitization to each reward. And actually, cells change. This is from Dr. Eric Nestler's paper in 2005. Is there a common pathway for, he meant drug, and substance and behavioral addiction? Is there a common pathway for all of these? That's the purpose of this paper that he published. And yes, the illustration is that there's a normal dopamine-producing cell, the cell with BTA on it, at the top. Notice the shrunken cell at the bottom. In other words, as Nuri was describing, there's actually a downgrading of the amount of dopamine produced, and on the target cell on the far right, in the nucleus accumbens, there's increased delta phosphate, and notice that there's more little sprouts coming out of that cell. That's called arborization, and that's also been found to occur with addiction. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. I'm going to fly through some of these slides and just describe what this means. But about 10 years ago, Dr. Nestler and others found that one of many chemicals in the brain that's produced when we want something is this chemical called delta phosphate. And it actually causes the brain to produce other chemicals. It's one of many, but it's a very important central chemical. And Dr. Nestler and others have done a lot of study. What they found is this chemical was produced by the brain in drug addiction, cocaine, heroin. They found it in many drugs, opioids. And then they found that with natural addictions within the last 10 years, yes, delta phosphate went up to high levels, just as it did with drug addictions, in overconsumption of natural rewards. These were laboratory studies primarily in rodents. The reason I'm showing this, he found, for instance, that it's important in food and sex. In this paper by Wallace at the top in 2008, found that yes, delta phosphate causes animals to overconsume natural rewards. Too much for their natural behavior, sex, too much food, too much wheel running, exercise addiction. It enhanced overexpression of delta phosphate, enhanced sexual reward in female Syrian hamsters. And Dr. Nestler talked about it being perhaps a marker in his landmark paper in the Royal Society in 2008. He said it actually may be used at some point as a biomarker to assess the state of activation of an individual's reward circuitry, as well as the degree to which the individual is addicted, both during the development of addiction and its gradual waning. So it's clearly a central chemical in the brain. His original paper, again, Common Pathway paper, talked about sexual addictions. He used the word addiction. This is a brain scientist. He doesn't use the word addiction lightly. When he says addiction, he means in a brain-changing kind of way. And this last one, look at the white at the bottom. These findings suggest delta phosphate in the brain sensitizes animals not only for drugs, but for natural rewards, such as food and sex, and may contribute to states of natural, there's that word again, addiction. And Wallace, in talking about food and sex, this study specifically looked at delta phosphate with food and sex. In summary, the work presented here provides evidence that, in addition to drugs abuse, natural rewards, that's in food and sex in this study, induce delta phosphate levels in the nucleus accumbens. Our results trace the possibility that delta phosphate induction in the nucleus accumbens may mediate not only key aspects of drug addiction, but also so-called aspects of natural addiction involving compulsive consumption of natural rewards. Neuroplasticity, Gary talked about that. It means changing the brain. We found out about this first about 1995 with some studies on violin players. We found, and Jurkowski, several had done studies on this, that when we looked at people that play the violin, particularly children that start early, the part of the brain that controls the left hand, which is the string part of the violin, is actually bigger. And the earlier the person starts playing the violin, the bigger it gets. Very interesting. So actually practice and thinking changes the shape of your brain. Jurkowski's study 2006 looked at medical students. They scanned their brains, looked at the size of the little bumps on the brain, before and after a 3-month period of intensive study for exams, and found that yes, those parietal areas that are important in learning got bigger after the study period as compared to before. So yes, learning things really can change your brain. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'd just like you to look at that last one. How learning sculpts brain structure. It really changes it. Learning changes it. Learning changes the brain for good, or as Malinka and Cower said in this study on synaptic plasticity and addiction, for bad, in the sense of negative consequences to the brain, and maladaptive consequences to our human experience. Addiction, they said, represents a pathological yet powerful form of learning and memory. I can't think of any model other than pornography, the frantic clicking and searching of pornography, that's a better neuroplastic model for learning than pornography. And sure enough, we found that we see negative neuroplasticity or atrophy in multiple addictions, whether they're natural or drug addictions: cocaine, meth, opioids, obesity, sexuality, and internet addiction. And this is an internet addiction. The bottom paragraph, our results indicate that long-term internet addiction would result in brain structural alterations, which probably contributed to chronic dysfunction in subjects with internet addiction disorder. A couple of years ago, I was privileged to be part of this research team. We published this paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it was a team with the University of Melbourne, Australia, and Duke University, and then UT San Antonio. And what we found were the same genes in the hypothalamus. DNA basically not only builds our bodies, but it constructs the engines of desire that tell us what we want when we get at certain cues. And so what we found were that the same genes that are turned on when an animal is subjected to severe salt craving, which is critical. No salt, you die. And animals die. Particularly ungulates, animals that don't get salt with meat. So if we cause those animals to become critically low in their salt intake, and then we satiate them, give them salt, it evokes these powerful genes, craving genes, you might say. Salt is the most basic of craving genes. It's not a drug, okay? It's salt. It's in every cell in our body, extra and intracellular. And so what we found were that the same genes that are awakened with the severe natural craving state are the same genes that are awakened in cocaine and heroin addiction. That had never been shown. National Geographic did an article in our paper and said that basically, they used the word hijack, that addiction hijacks these natural brain craving engines. And I think that's a good article. Wolfgang, who wrote this in our paper, Wolfgang Lütke at Duke, said it's usurping the pleasure reward systems that are important in survival. And what happens then are changes like dendritic arborization. I showed you that other slide with those extra sprouts. Years ago, we found, notice on the left is a brain wire connecting two brain cells. On the right is a brain wire with other little brain wires coming off of it. Those are called dendrites coming off this axon. And we found with cocaine that it sprouts. These are basically reaching out and touching someone. They're trying to reach out and touch a new brain cell so they can talk to a new brain cell. They said, hey guys, I found this new stuff called cocaine. It's amazing. And that's what these little sprouts are trying to tell other brain cells. And guess what? We found out with salt craving, Reuteman's paper, that even severe salt, when it's like, I'm going to die if I don't eat salt, and then you get the salt, it's such a fundamental craving that the brain also arborizes dendrites just like it did for cocaine. And yes, in the last couple of years, a study on sex found that sex does that uniquely with natural rewards, just like salt, severe salt, like death level salt deprivation. So sex is a pretty powerful drive. And obviously, I know it's a surprise to the world because sex has become strictly recreational, right? And with porn, it's spectator sport, right? But I have, sex actually, believe it or not, does have something to do with making more people. I mean, I know that's a radical thing to say. I'm sorry. And I really like how Voss worded this. Did I say his name right? Faust, okay. The dopamine helping males copulate for at least 200 million years. What he means by that is if you go back in evolution to when mammals and birds diverged about 200 million years ago, that diversion, basically those dopamine paths were definitely very similar in that common ancestor 200 million years ago. So it's been around for a while. The other thing I'd like to talk about is hunting. Any turkey hunters here? Elk hunters? Okay, turkey hunters. So there's hen calls, right? And that's where you're like a hen, you're calling the male and come and get me, honey, right? Same thing with elk. There you go, he knows the call. So these are basically calls where it makes males stupid, right? Makes the turkey stupid, he comes in looking for the hen. So does sex make us stupid? This is a paper by Georgiadis. What it basically says is that as we become sexually aroused or start thinking about sex, that thinking part of the brain goes to sleep. And the more arousal a person is sexually, the more the thinking part of the brain goes to sleep. Including when the person's having orgasm, it pretty much shuts down. Okay? So what does that say for if men are thinking about sex all day in the male brain? Not too good. Zimbardo at Stanford's talked about this with the demise of guys. He talked about it in his, it's actually a talk, he has a TED Talk on it, he has an ebook. The demise of guys, how boys are falling behind girls, graduation, everything. It's great the girls are surging, I applaud it, but it's not just because the girls are doing well, that they are. It's also because guys are fading to a certain extent. And he says it's because of what he calls arousal addiction, access to porn and video games, boys' brains are being sexually rewired. Tin Burgin won the Nobel Prize in '73. He's a biologist, and he found that if you took plaster eggs, painted them real big and bright, the birds would leave their own eggs and nest the plaster eggs. Called a supranormal stimulus, a stimulus above what the animal encounters in its evolutionary natural environment. And then he did an experiment where he took these butterflies, and it turns out the males of the species were attracted to mate with the female based on her wings. So he painted these bigger paper wings, bigger and brighter than normal female wings. And guess what? The males ignored the real female butterflies to mate with the larger, prettier fake butterfly wings. Sound familiar? Yeah. Think about that one for just a minute. Naomi Wolf described, she said the same thing like this. She said, for the first time in human history, the images, power, and allure have supplanted that of real naked women. Today, real naked women are just bad porn. Pheromones, remember we got the bright idea 150 years ago that if we used pheromones, basically pheromones are scents, that's how gypsy moths found each other. We found that if we used little pellets and scented with pheromones, that we could prevent gypsy moths from finding each other. And okay, this is a good one. This is again talking about moths. So you confuse them. They can't smell the female. They get this powerful female scent, and it's fake. So they can't mate. There's no more gypsy moths. The male either becomes confused and doesn't know which way to turn for the female, or he becomes desensitized to the lower levels of pheromones naturally given out by the female and has no incentive to mate with her. Sound familiar? Is that moths or is that people? And ASAM, American Society of Addiction Medicine, they have come out, it's a group of medical doctors, and said, yes, pornography is an addiction, gambling is an addiction, food is an addiction, it changes your brain. ASAM's, it has basically come out with their definition 2 years ago. DSM is still lagging, although they've admitted that, what? Poker is an addiction, but not porn? Two guys at 2 in the morning frantically clicking? You're safe as long as it's poker. Norman Deutsch, the addictive to internet porn is not a metaphor. Not all addictions are to drugs or alcohol. All addiction involves long-time, lifelong neuroplastic change. So the last couple of minutes, remember, what's the perspective? Why are we protecting this stuff? Why are we destroying human intimacy in the name of porn? $100 billion a year, that's why. It's a big business. It's like Wall Street. Wall Street actually is one of the biggest purveyors of porn. White-collar porn, hotel porn. It's like this guy, this is a Wall Street, white-collar businessman. He said, I'm not selling drugs, it's Wall Street. Steve Hirsch, in talking about his lecture, said 10 years ago, I don't think I would have been asked to speak in front of that class. Hirsch says in an interview later, adding none of the 2300 graduates question the content he sells. We're already past the acceptance stage. At this point, we're just talking about a business as a business. We're nothing more than widget makers, he said. So, is he a widget maker? This paper, I'm just going to summarize briefly. Anna Bridges, they took XBiz, the adult industry magazine, looked at the top 250 porn titles, found that 88% show aggression towards women. Name calling, slapping, punching, hitting, hurtful. Okay, 88%. And none of the films that they examined, this is not just your S&M porn, this is the top-selling and renting 250 porn titles from XBiz. And they found that never does the male have intercourse with the female. He always ejaculates outside the female on her body, frequently on her face. And so Filbert also published a study which says, yes, porn does increase attitudes of rape and acceptance towards women, and Malmuth and Hall published a meta-analysis that said, yeah, we can't say that even regular porn doesn't increase that either. Yale, for instance, was recently censored for failing to expel students guilty of sexual assault. And Shelley Lubin said, any actresses admit they've experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, and neglect by parents, some were raped by relatives. We were taught at a young age that sex made us unvaluable, the same horrible violations we experienced then. We relive in front of the camera, we hate every minute of it. Jim Powers, in the recent book by Chris Hedges, said, now they are 19, he's in pornography, he said, they're hookers, they don't care, they're a throwaway commodity, a throwaway world. And Robert Jensen here at UT Austin said, what does it say about our culture that cruelty is so easy to market? We accept a culture flooded with images of women who are sexual commodities, increasingly women in porn, not just people having sex, but bodies and women's sexual activities of increasing cruelty are played out. And many men, maybe a majority, like it. So mirror images, mirror cells in our brain, it doesn't matter whether we're looking at it, if we look at it and our mirror systems are active, we think we're doing it. It's called the mirror systems of the brain. And Maras, who was the editor of the journal I published in Paris, said in a paper where they looked at the mirror systems of the brain of people watching porn, and they found that the mirror neuron system prompts the observers of the erotic movies to resonate with, this is a quote from the motivational state of other individuals appearing in visual depictions of sexual interactions. Remember, this is dopamine. This is arousal. And so what emotional state are they watching? Well, Bill Maher said it. He's a very famous male pornography star. He said, I'd really like to show what I believe that men want to see, violence against women. I firmly believe we show a purpose in showing that. The most violent we can get is ejaculation in the face. Men get off on that because we get even with the women they can't have. We try to inundate the world with orgasms in the face. And Steve Hirsch, then, considering that limited, Steve Hirsch produces about $100 million of porn every year, okay? Consider this about Steve. He said in the interview, would he want his infant daughter Alexis to be a vivid star? He smiles and leans back in his overstuffed leather chair. I tell him to think that through, he says. I would respect whatever decision she would make, and then I would send her to medical school. So, in summary then, I agree with what Weller and Will said. He said the best way of convincing young men to treat women with respect is to educate those traditional values of character to make it a disgrace to treat anyone basely, dishonestly, or exploitively. Moreover, the surest way of raising young men to treat young women as friends rather than as objects for sexual exploitation is to appeal to their natural longing to be honored and esteemed by the young women to whom they are attracted. And finally, I agree with Shakespeare. Refrain tonight, guard recovery, and that shall lend a hand of easiness to the next abstinence. The next, more easy for use, almost can change the stamp of nature, and either master the devil or throw him out with wondrous potency. I agree with Shakespeare. There is a stamp of nature. Pornography is a powerful inducer of that stamp of neuroplasticity. Thank you.